grab somebody in the house with shorties and audios and their eyes are okay?
Grab them, compel them to come in, go out into the highways and byways.
Have a synagogue. You walk by a synagogue and there's only 9 adult males in it. You can grab somebody off the street and have church.
See, there we go. Now we're officially outnumbered.
If there was many
We
people
were waiting
in the audience
specifically for
around the panel, then you don't come with a panel and just give it the nearest panel.
Swap classes.
Shall we get going then? All right.
Let us do so.
Okay, so I just got here. I was trying to set up in the dealer room, but I came running over here for this. This first panel of Archon, at least to me, this is Pulp Stories, Remo Williams, The Phantom, and Beyond. And let's let the panelists introduce themselves.
I'm R.J. Carter, notorious media whore, writer of Alice's Journey Beyond the Moon, Night Before Christmas, and I just announced a second ago I am the newest ghostwriter for Warren Murphy's Destroyer series. So when number 151 comes out, hopefully next month, you'll all run out and pick up on the adventures of Remo Williams the Destroyer.
I'm Andrew Matthews. I'm an author and artist here on fiction. Just completed a murder mystery manuscript set in the 1920s. That's about as close as I've come to ever writing anything that can be construed as vaguely of the culture.
I'm Van Allen Plexico. I write new pulp, adventure fiction, space opera, superhero, nonfiction, sports, pretty much anything. But I've been involved in the new pulp movement from the very beginning, since probably 2005, and was even writing stuff that's ended up in it back in 1995, 96, 97. So that's probably why I'm involved. And I've been a member of the Pulp Factory Writers and Artists and Editors group for about 10 years now, and actually won 2 Pulp Factory Awards, Novel of the Year and Anthology of the Year this past year in Chicago for this book, got Novel of the Year, The Shattering Kings of Oblivion, 3rd volume in it. And I also host the White Rocket podcast where we talk about pop culture topics every week or so. So I guess is there other stuff that
You're all over the place.
I'm all over the place. I'm a mess.
I can't keep track.
I'm a mess. Yes. And you are.
I am Guy Anthony DeMarco, and I also write across pretty much everything. Always been a pulp fan, going back typically in the 30s. I like a lot of the old pulpy style stuff, like stuff from Harl Vincent. I was a real big fan of Harl Vincent. He wasn't the world's best writer, but I just like his stories. That's what Pulp's for. And I'm actually working on a Moon Man novella for one of the Airship 29 imprints in Colorado. So hopefully they'll like it and they'll publish it.
For who's it for?
Airship.
For Airship? Yeah, Airship published a bunch of mine.
Oh,
Yeah,
cool.
Ron Forty or Ron Davis. That's absolutely. They are at the forefront of new pulp. Airship and Pro Se. Tommy Hancock. Those are the 2 leading. Yes.
I just, sorry, I know it's early. I wanted to ask a question though. You are talking about new pulp. So what do you consider to be the new pulp?
Let's do it. All right. I'll throw out a couple of things. You guys add in whatever you want. I guess just because she was looking at me, she said. Pulp, original pulp, I've always, and most of us have generally defined pulp, it's not a genre. Any genre can be pulp if you do it in a pulp style. Pulp is a style, it's an approach, it's a way of writing. So you could do pirate pulp, you could do cowboy pulp, you can do science fiction, space opera pulp. It's the style of writing that is very action oriented, it's very plot driven, very colorful, very vivid, very lurid in cases. You know, it's not trying to be literary, it's trying to get you to throw down the money for the next issue or the next installment. That was big in the 1930s and 40s in particular, because this was before comic books really took off, and certainly before television, and so that was the main alternative to, you know, to novels and so forth, was the pulps. And they were called pulps because they were printed in these fairly cheap paper little magazines. And the slicks were what everybody wanted to get their stories into. All the writers wanted to be in the slicks, where you had the real literary aspiring guys, right?
You have to explain what a slick is.
Well, slick paper is really nice, expensive paper, literary approach. The pulp was cheap paper made out of pulp wood that could crumble, pretty quickly. But of course, the great irony is, and I'm gonna get to new pulp. The great irony is that that today the slicks are almost forgotten, and the pulp stuff is what comes out in leather-bound $100 volumes, because that was the stuff that people loved.
Nobody's writing new slick.
Yeah, exactly. There's no new slicks. New pulp, though, emerged really, I think it really kind of broke onto the scene with the advent of print-on-demand publishing about 10 or 15 years ago. Because what pulp does as an industry is try to put out product at a speedy, you're typing fast, you're publishing fast, at a speedy pace, at the cheapest way of getting it to the public possible. Print on demand was the cheapest way for pulp type style authors to do that 10 years ago. Now it's ebooks. So today's pulp is really ebooks. There's still, lots of paperbacks and stuff, and hardcovers, but I think that Kindle and other ebooks really are the new pulp medium because it's the cheapest way to crank stuff out. So, and it's really been a revelation because it's freed up so many creative people to be able to go out and reach an audience. I mean, it's provided an avenue that wasn't there 15 years ago, where people can contribute stories. You're talking about you got a story in an anthology, right? And that got you noticed and everything. Artists have way more product that they can get their art on and in. Airship, they do interior illustrations for everything, so interior black and white artists have an avenue now to get their stuff out to the public. It's really been amazing how it's provided all new content, and it's also provided an avenue for creators. And the last thing I'll say, to me, it's like the advent of cable television. Before new pulp, before print on demand, before ebook, the big publishers were like ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, right? And that was where you had to go. That was the only channels you had. Now you've got the Home and Garden channel, right? You've got ESPN 74. You've got all these channels. And in new pulp, if you want to read, British-inspired dark Gothic military space opera written by an American, then you got that channel, right? Or other stuff, Destroyer, right? Or whatever, So, gentlemen, what have I left out? Because we did need to do that first. I appreciate that you asked that.
Some of the new pulp is actually carrying on new adventures of old characters. So they're reviving a bunch of, some that are in the public domain, some are licensed. And people will pick up stories for characters that some people have forgotten, except for people who are real enthusiasts. And they're running new adventures for them, and they're finding new audiences, people are finding the old stories, just because they enjoy it, because it's a fun, enjoyable style of writing, and people enjoy reading that. It's not something you're going to sit down at a beach and read a giant tome of high literature. It's fun. That's the whole point of it.
What's funny too is that when it originally appeared, it was contemporary. And now when people go back and write in the public domain characters that you can write for free, you don't have to pay a license. They're ones that have gone out of copyright. That's public domain. You write them now, and you set them back in those days, and they become period pieces. So you're writing almost historical fiction. In other words, when that 1930s Indiana Jones era stuff was being written in the 30s, that was contemporary. And now it's like Indiana Jones stories, even though it's exactly the same,
Yeah, I think if you're trying to write pulp, a lot of people will go for a noir kind of element, and there's a charm to that kind of stuff. One of my favorite noirs to read is Jim Mulaney's Craig Banyan series, which is it's basically he's just the PI, the Maltese Falcon guy. He just happens to live in a world where his receptionist is a Christmas elf from the North Pole, and the Grim Reaper will hang around waiting for bodies to drop. Oh, I'm just here because this guy's going to fall over in a few minutes. It's funny as hell, but it's still, I was sitting in my office one day, and it just, the whole...
When she walked in.
Yeah.
I mean, what you're talking about Indiana Jones, that is derived virtually straight from a 1930s adventure movie. there was something online a while back where they showed comparison shots between the original 30s movie and the first Indiana Jones movie, and that's a straight lift. So it's been popular for several decades, and that's that two-fisted action. You don't hang around setting the scene. It's not all sort of literary set up, but it's straight in there. It's two-fisted action. The guy walks in with a gun. What do? It's a Maltese Falcon. It's action all the way.
And even the heroes that would come out of what you would consider the traditional pulp era, the Shadow, the Spider, they weren't more than normal humans. They had a gun or they had a mask, but by golly, you followed them, and we followed them for decades.
And they had a dark side. They always had a kind of a dark side that when you go into the comics, the four-color comics, with even Batman, for a lot of his history was more of a bright, happy, positive Batman, even as strange as that seems, But the brooding Dark Knight Batman that we think of today, that is more in line with the classic pulp characters, I think. You think of it as dark and willing to deal death. I mean, this was before the comics code or any kind of restrictions, and the Spider just like gunned down dozens of people in every story.
Yeah, and they're one-trick ponies as far as what they can do. Remo Williams is, begin with the Pinnacle line, which was very pulpy paper. I've got some of the old ones to verify that. His thing is he's the best martial artist in the world. He's been trained in Sinanju, which is the sun source of all the martial arts, and that's what he does. He kills people for money. He's hired by Cure. This person's a threat to America. Now this person's a threat to America. Go out and take care of them. But the way he does it and the stories that get woven around it, they're all over-the-top villains or over-the-top situations. The commentary, constant cliffhangers. And then his partner, his master Chun, is just his comic relief. So you've got your hero is there to kill people, but he's always got somebody that makes you want to come back and appreciate what's going on in a more contemporary setting.
A lot of them did have a kind of a humorous sidekick or a side character back then. It's fascinating, and a lot of them are so stereotypical. The first thing I wrote for Airship was several years ago was a Griffin story where Arch Whitehouse had been writing aviation pulps back in the 30s. It was kind of like an air ace, and there was the Nazis. It's that Raiders of the Lost Ark period. It was not World War II yet, but the Nazis are out there and they're causing trouble, right? That's just such a great period to set stories in. So you don't have to deal with a war. You just have the Nazis before the war. It's great. So I had to do a bunch of research and read a whole lot of his stories, and he's got an Irish drunken chauffeur that is named like Barney O'Dare, and it's just as bad as you think it is. And I was going, how far can I really take this? Because I'm writing this today. This book will be banned in Ireland if I'm not careful. If I write him true to his character, it's not, So yeah, they really very stereotypical, just right out there, no restraints.
Like the old Dick Tracy cartoon characters.
Oh gosh.
And I've seen how they drive in Ireland. I mean, when the coach driver goes through a red light and says, "Oh, that was a funny shade of green."
Okay, so well, let's see. So the pulps were huge in the 30s and 40s. They kind of went away. They went away originally, I guess, because of a combination of the golden age of comics kind of came along and started eroding into them a little bit, because there you had pictures on every page. It wasn't just a picture every so often, and then all this text. And then I guess eventually television after World War II, movies too, yeah. So it was just hard to compete. And plus, I have to think that you had a different audience back then, because you had an audience then that didn't mind their entertainment being a big, thick thing you had to read with just text and text and text, Whereas the average person today that the pulps were trying to sell to back then wouldn't want all those words and words and words, right? They want a DVD or a Blu-ray, or they want something quick and easy and
2 hours of entertainment, now they're done.
Right. They looked if the people that they were aiming them at back then, today, they would look at it and go, I read all that. So you have to today reach an audience that is interested in that is willing to pay to read, an adventure story, sometimes serial adventure story. You know what I'm getting at? Am I making any sense at all here? I mean, it's a different audience today, in other words.
Yeah, I think today people have a shorter attention span to some extent. They want the same bite, they want something quick. Okay, we've done that, moving on. So a pulp story would fit in with that mindset.
Right.
Back then, they didn't have the competition
Right.
for other entertainment.
Exactly.
Yeah, I read an article, one of the things they were saying that helped nail the death of the pulps back then was when they started developing the pocketbook paperbacks.
Paperback. Mass market paperbacks.
Mass market paperbacks.
Yeah.
Was basically the real nail in the coffin for them, because they were able to get more higher types of literature out to people, and so then people were paying attention to what each other was reading. So you didn't want to be caught reading Doc Savage, Man of Bronze. You wanted to be caught reading something that people look and go, oh this person is well read.
That's why comics have always struggled in this country to find a larger audience. In Japan, you can be anywhere reading a comic book and nobody thinks anything about it.
Oh yeah,
but up until probably the last 10 or 15 years, with the movie world blowing up, you couldn't, you'd be made fun of, other than like an enlisted man in the army, maybe you could kind of get away with reading a comic or something. I always show that in movies and stuff. But other than that, yeah, you cover it up. You have a magazine over it or something.
But the mass market paperback introduction, that sort of introduced a new kind of pulp. I mentioned that Remo started in Pinnacle. Well, Pinnacle was producing all these very fast 60,000 word adventure stories. Yeah, you had the executioner, you had the penetrator, you had the intimidator, you had the defenestrator. And they were all these men's action adventure stories.
Men's action, yeah, that was it. See, because the old pulp magazines would be anthologies basically. They'd have a multitude of different stories and characters and writers involved. Let's go back kind of to the early days. You had probably two of the earliest that are still really thought well of today are Robert E. Howard and Edgar Rice Burroughs. And Howard was constantly coming up with new characters, new settings, and sending those stories off to. He was aiming for the higher end magazines and never getting in. And he would end up settling always for like Oriental stories or Weird Tales. Yeah, that was kind of his last resort. And they'd buy him almost every time. But he didn't want to be with them. They didn't always pay him. See, because this was back, it's been a while since I've read Blood and Thunder, so I'm trying to think the exact years. But this wasn't Depression era, but it was still.
It still wasn't a good time.
In Texas, yeah, in a Texas roughneck oil town, between oil breakthroughs, it wasn't, yeah. So he was trying to scratch out a living. So these guys were just throwing everything against the wall, seeing what would stick, basically, what somebody would send them a check for. And so they were cramming all these stories and all these authors into these magazines, and you have a bunch of different stuff. What the mass market paperback does is just give you one author, one story, pretty much. Sometimes they put two or something. But so you could kind of focus more on what you really, So you could focus more on what you really want. So.
They get a longer story. In the magazines, lots of times they would take a novel and they would break it up into 5, 6 pieces, and they would serialize it so you'd buy the next one so you could finish the rest of the novel.
Yeah, they continued doing that all the way through the 60s. Like, a number of the big science fiction novels back in the day were serialized in Galaxy and
Planet Stories.
Right. You had a question?
Yeah, you may have covered this before I came in, but tell me what is considered pulp fiction to you, and how that differs from the other fiction of the time?
Yeah, we sort of touched on it as being a style rather than a genre. What did we not say about it that we still need to? I mean, it's you do it in a hurry. You're getting paid like a penny a word or something. some of those authors were famous. The one that who's the one that did was it the Doc Savage one?
Lester Dent?
Lester Dent, was he the one? There's several that have interesting stories. Would have like 5 typewriters going at once. This is the equivalent of having like 5 windows open in Word today. He'd have 5 typewriters going, and he'd have a rolling chair, and he would write on one until his his finger band-aids or whatever they had. He'd write on one until he got to a point where he wasn't sure what happened next. Then he'd just roll down to the next typewriter and go and then write on that one until he got to the stop point. And he would just keep going and just keep cranking that stuff out, keep cranking it out. I mean that makes my brain hurt to think about doing something like that, But they could do that.
Yeah, he was going for quantity, but luckily he got some quality from it.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And the funny story about you just said his name, Lester Dent. The Lester Dent story that's so funny is when he was first starting out, he was working. I want to say like a government office or something, and they had typewriters and stuff, right? And he started reading some of the very earliest pulps, and he thought, this stuff isn't very good. People buy this, and the newsstand guy's like, oh yeah, we sell a lot of this stuff. And he's like, I could write better than this. So he started coming into work like 2 or 3 hours early when there was nobody in the office and using the typewriters to write. And one day, this other guy comes in and he sees him sitting there hammering away. And he's like, Lester, what are you doing here so early? What are you working on? And he's like, well, I'm writing these stories that I'm sending out these magazines. It's kind of sci-fi stuff, whatever. And the guy's like, oh, and he starts making fun of him, oh, that's so silly, that's so goofy, what are you doing that for? And the guy's like, and Lester says, well, they send me a check for X amount of money every month. The guy's like, scoot over. And he gets a check back for it. So they were motivated by making a living. This is how they made their living, and they had to crank it out.
When he put out Doc Savage, he really launched a cottage industry. I mean, Doc Savage, first name Clark, man of some kind of metal.
Yeah.
He has a fortress of solitude in a very snowy place. He's on the top of the Empire State Building, so if you want to look at him, you got to look up in the sky.
And he has a lot of super villain enemies that are trying to kind of kill him.
No Doc Savage, there's no Superman.
The only difference, I guess, really is instead of reporter and photographer friends, he had like a little team of secret agent helpers.
Yeah, but they all had their own specialty.
But they all did, yeah. Well, and every one of those heroes seemingly had like a little support team, around them, or a whole bunch of them.
Shadow had his operatives.
They had their support team for sure. Yeah, there really was a genre. In fact, Lester Dent would do what we think of today as seminars, where you could pay him $100 or whatever the going rate was back then, and he would teach you how to write.
The Lester Dent method.
The Lester Dent method, right? He says you got to have this, and this. This has got to happen first, then this happens, then this, and then this. And he had a map. I mean, you just plug your characters' names in.
You can actually go on Google and you can find it. It's a 6,000 word story. He said if you use this method, you never ever got rejected. And it says in the first 1,500 words, this has to occur. And you start out immediately with everyone's in peril. And the next thing is you ramp up the peril. The next thing is you ramp up the peril yet again. And then in the end, you think, okay, he's got to fail, but he pulls it off somehow. And he's got this all laid out, and it's called the Lester Dent method. Just Google that.
And the Spider in particular had the great titles, right? It's almost like you could have, it's like those like the Chinese food ordering thing: column A, column B, column C, column D. So as long as it's got like the, and then you're gonna have something like Satan or devil or fire, and then the next one would be like death or reaper or something, and you just, so you'd end up with like the Satan fire gun, or the devil murder spree, or it's just every one of them had that same formula. It was really amazing. It's just amazing how they had it down to such a science. It almost is like you're seeing behind too much inside baseball.
They all get a formula going. Warren Murphy and Dick Sapir, when they did The Destroyer, they didn't have the formula for the first couple of books, but after that, it was always, the first chapter was, introducing some poor schmuck who's going to die at the end of the chapter, and, this always leaves the unanswered questions like, but would anyone ever know that the government was planning on turning people's brains into Swiss cheese. And you turn to chapter 2, and chapter 2 always was, his name was Remo. And something. And Remo's doing his thing, and then later on he finds out about the task and he gets sent on to do the mission. But
Think about this. Think about the old A-Team show. They had that exact formula, right, where the opening bit was some guest actor in peril. Oh no, what am I going to do? I'm going to have to contact the A-Team. And then Act 2, they contact the A-Team. And then the whole rest of it was the A-Team goes into action, same way, just cookie cutter, right? I mean, I think that's why, to me, that's why that show actually got dull, is because they made it so obvious that they were sticking to that formula. You have to do things every now and then to, even if you don't tamper with the formula, you can disguise it a little bit, you know?
everybody knew how to contact the A-Team except the Army.
Yes. It was very easy to, all the Army had to do was just like put somebody in disguise and say, help, I'm in trouble. And then,
No check.
yes, sir.
So, what, besides mysteries and science fiction, what else, other genres have pulp heroes?
Well, we were saying just about any genre can be written in the pulp style. The big ones obviously were the 30s, 40s crime. How would you describe that? It's like the lone
Gumshoe style.
He's either a gumshoe or he's a vigilante,
Yeah.
like the Shadow, the Spider, that kind of guy. The Avenger, forgot about him.
I love the Avenger.
Oh yeah. Well, the great thing about the Avenger is his opening story was such a great puzzle where you don't know where his whole family disappears. That's like one of these. How many movies have we seen in the last 20, 30 years where it starts out with somebody thinks they're crazy because everything that they know is suddenly gone? Everybody's like, that never existed. There have been a dozen movies like that, right? The Avenger was doing that 100 years ago.
But he was the
right?
first one that actually had what I would consider a pulp hero superpower, because he had gone ashen, his face had turned gray, and it was malleable, and he could change the shape of it to look like anybody, just put makeup on it, and he'd go in and infiltrate organizations.
Anybody, yeah. So yeah, detectives, vigilantes, spies.
Science fiction was big in the pulps. I mean, I've got some amazing stories at home with Ray Bradbury stuff.
Sure.
So.
Sure, yeah, but it's just about anything. It's just a matter of. I mean, you could argue that all the Western novels back in the day were a Western type of pulp. There were even romance pulps. I mean, it's funny. You can look at what comics did in the 50s and 60s, and that's pretty much what pulp was doing in the 30s and 40s. Like Jack Kirby was drawing romance comics, in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, because that's what had been selling before in the pulps in part, and so he just carried that over into comics. What other characters or genres have we left out? That's a good
Westerns.
question.
Westerns.
Yeah, westerns, and I mean, there's almost nothing you can't do in a pulp style.
Horror is another one that was pretty big.
Yeah.
How about inventors? Were there?
Sure.
I'm trying to think.
Let's see.
Doc Savage had a little bit of that in him.
Yeah, he was a big inventor. I'm trying to think of the. Oh.
It was Tom Swift.
Tom
before
Swift,
that.
thank you. He was.
I would say that was almost like the 20s, but yeah, the leading edge pulp, I guess.
I always wanted to see him written with a little bit of Bobby Fischer to it. I think that would be a very interesting character.
Well, I mentioned Robert E. Howard, and I think that Howard is such a great example of why pulp has survived and holds up today, because he's such a great example of pulp writing. I mean, just like in the movie about him, the Whole Wide World, there's that great scene where I guess Vincent D'Onofrio is playing him, and he's sitting there at the typewriter, and he's just like, and then Conan walked, and you think he writes it the way that it reads, It sounds like the giant 6.5-foot guy banging away on the going through typewriters because he's wrecking them, I mean, that's Howard. That was how Howard was, and you go back and read Howard's stuff today, any of the Conan stuff, it so holds up. I mean, the movies and the comics and all are derivative, but not ever nearly as powerful as what Howard did. And his Solomon Kane stuff was kind of cutting edge. There, we had a lot of the puritanical, stuff to it. And he was even writing, Howard was even writing multiple stories about the Crusades. He always have some big Irishman with an axe, you know, coming down to Palestine to fight Saladin man to man, you know. And you read those and just go, man, I wish history class had been as exciting as this, you know.
Burroughs is another good example because he wrote the science fiction Barsoom series, Pellucidor. There's a whole bunch of stuff that he drifted off into because he could make a solid pulp story that people would like, and he could serialize it, and they would buy it. That's the most important thing.
The other thing about Pulp, you can mix things up a bit. I mean, there was a movie a few years ago starring Fred Ward called Cast a Deadly Spell. It was about PI, gumshoe and classic era 1930s. But that was an alternative world where people used magic. I mean, that opened with a scene, this woman's walking through a railroad station followed by her luggage, which was bobbling on merrily in midair. But his stick was he didn't use magic. He was up against cases where it was used, but he had to figure out what went on, when, and who done it. That was a neat take on it. So again, Pulp, you stir things up a bit with it.
I guess today you can see the division. It's almost like this division we see between, for example, Tor and Bayan, because Bayan is really kind of doing military pulp, science fiction pulp, whereas Tor is just trying really hard to matter, you know, to be literate and sociological and deeply, profoundly thinking, and Tor's like, blow up aliens, you know, I mean, Bayan is like, blow up aliens, so, you know, you still even see that division today between, I guess, you know, Tor would consider itself the slicks, and Bayan is the pulp, pretty much.
Tor was my introduction actually to the Destroyer, because they did, I guess 150 was the last one, and then this anthology, but then there were 4 books that Tor did with Warren Murphy and Jim Mulaney writing together. And I'd had a friend who knew I was doing book reviews for a website. At the time it was the Trades, now it's Critical Blast. And he said, "Oh, you should get the new Destroyer book that's coming out. You'd love him." I'm like, "Who's the Destroyer?" And now I'm sitting here writing it. So thanks, Keith.
There's so many Destroyers, by the way. That's one of those names that is just so great because it can be good or bad. You know, you can be a good destroyer or a bad destroyer. Like there's
Conan the Destroyer.
There's Conan the Destroyer. There's Drax the Destroyer.
There's the guy in the Thor movie.
The Destroyer robot. There's the Destroyer of World War II. There's in the Invaders of Captain America. That kind of like a vision. There's been a lot of destroyers, but he's pretty much, your guy is pretty much the preeminent one, I guess, until.
And I don't think anybody ever calls him that. He doesn't even call himself that unless he.
Is it just the name of the series?
It's the name of the series, and then every once in a while it got sort of mysticism put into it. I mean, he starts fighting androids, he starts fighting mad scientists, and now he's a fulfillment of prophecy. So if it gets really, really dire, and he's down on his luck, he's about to die, he becomes the avatar of Shiva, and he just, his eyes go black, and he stands up and says, "I am created Shiva, the Destroyer!"
There you go.
And it's over.
I started to mention Shiva, and I didn't even know that. Isn't that funny? Because I teach religion and talk about Shiva all the time, and how, well, that's the thing about Shiva, is Shiva can be good or bad. Shiva can destroy your bad karma, like a wrecking crew, and get the bad stuff out of the way. So a destroyer can definitely be a good force, a force for good. So that's the key. Wow, I've learned something tonight. I don't know about the rest of it. Yeah, talking about, you mentioned Edgar Rice Burroughs, and I wanted to follow up on that for a second. We saw the John Carter movie. What did you guys think about the John Carter movie 2012?
I just rewatched it about 2 days ago.
Yeah.
I like the books better, and I thought it was an enjoyable. If you look at it with a pulpy eye, I thought it was enjoyable.
Okay, what did you guys think about it?
I again liked the books better, but I wasn't as acidic toward it as a lot of the critics seem to be. It told the story.
I like the books. I enjoyed the movie. I thought that was more sin against than sinning.
It didn't do well, perhaps you heard.
Yeah.
And that was a blow for Pulp, I think. But part of it was that people said, "Oh, I've seen all this before. They're ripping off Star Wars or whatever." you know, which is like when people told me, oh, this Lord of the Rings movie is ripping off Harry Potter, and then I went to throw stuff at them. You know? Oh, Gandalf, he's such a Dumbledore copy. Like, I will kill you now. That's
But
right.
you know what I said about Doc Savage, I'm going to say about John Carter, because I was laid up in the hospital when I met John Carter. I was reading The Princess of Mars, and I had to go back and look at the date on the copy. I'm like, okay, he's an alien on another planet, and the lesser gravity allows him to leap tall buildings in a single bound.
That's right. That's just so, yeah, Superman is so more derivative than you ever
Yes.
realize until you started looking at all this stuff. It's amazing.
Not original at all. And then you bring up Philip Wiley's Gladiator and throw that to the mix. and you just-
I mean, you mentioned Dr. Savage. I hear there's rumours of a new Dr. Savage movie.
You hear that a lot, yeah. We've been constantly being told that there's a new Doc Savage movie coming. And
We'll pass over the Ron Ely version. Hopefully,
Yes.
pretending we never saw it.
There's a new Destroyer movie.
is there finally? I mean,
And there is finally Shane Black. has
oh, that's right.
attached to it.
Yeah, that's right.
I know the guy who's writing it, but he can't talk about it.
But you can.
I ask him questions, and all I get back is, I can't talk about it.
Well, there was a Shadow movie back in, what, the late 80s with Alec Baldwin.
Yeah.
I mean, they keep trying, but they just never quite get. And we had a new Conan movie with Jason Momoa, which wasn't horrible. And I mean, I give Jason credit. I mean, at least they got somebody that made a different and more interesting Conan in a way. You know,
The Green Hornet movie.
yeah, the Green Hornet movie, which Ron and Rob both wanted to jump off a building when that came out. Oh gosh, Ron still complains about that thing.
The Shadow movie suffers massively, and I knew it was gonna be a problem when I heard the writer interviewed, and he said, yeah, I remembered that line, the Shadow knows,
Mm.
and it's literally all he knew. He wrote the entire movie based on, yeah, I heard that line,
Yeah.
the Shadow knows.
And he was basically thinking about the big.
Yeah, I saw.
Shadow's nose.
The guy literally knew nothing about it going in.
That's a big part of it, is that and you know, the thing is, even when you have creators behind a project like that do know it, they go to Hollywood, and the Hollywood people take it and go, mangle, mangle,
Yeah.
mangle, mangle.
League of Extraordinary
What was,
Gentlemen.
what was the great line that's been, I heard this line at maybe at Dragon Con, where they said that when Sam Raimi first went into Sony to do Spider-Man, they sat down at the table, all the top Sony people, and everybody was good, everybody's good, and then this one Sony top executive says, well, but does it have to be a spider?
Just making a cricket.
Because spiders are kind of yucky, and is anybody going to go see that?
Some people just don't get
Many
it.
years ago, possibly in this very room, George R.R. Martin told a story about Enemy Mine, the great Very Long Year novel, and why the film diverts so weirdly halfway through. And it involves an executive sitting at a table saying, I don't understand what happened to mine. Enemy Mine. Where is the
Did
mine?
it blow up? Is it stuck to the battleship?
Why the entire second half of that film just suddenly
Nice.
veers off into,
Is there still uranium in it?
yeah. Is they were, yeah.
Well, you know what happened to John Carter, in retrospect, is pretty obvious, was that there was one group of people running Disney, and they had decided that they had little girls pretty much under their spell, right? But they needed to get properties that would appeal to adolescent boys. And they said, I know, let's get the old classic stuff. And so they did Pirates of the Caribbean, they tried to do the Haunted Mansion, they got the Lone Ranger, and they got John Carter. And they were in the process of doing all of those, and John Carter was the one that was taking the longest, it was the hardest. They had a great
Most
director.
expensive.
Most of it, they had great director attached, great cast. I especially love Lynn Carter.
Everything that the Lone Ranger
Collins.
wasn't.
Yeah, and everything was great. And right when it was in production, the leadership completely changed, and the new leadership came in and said, let's just acquire properties that young boys already like. So they bought Marvel, and they bought Star Wars from George Lucas. And then somebody said, we've got this A Princess of Mars movie. And they went, Princess of Mars, no young boys are going to want to see that. And Mars, nobody watches Mars movies anymore. We just had Mars Needs Women and nobody went to see it. Clearly this is just like that. So lose the Princess and Mars, and they said, well, we'll go with John Carter Mars. And like, okay, no, get rid of the Mars. So it just became John Carter. So it just got whittled down and whittled down. It had no support from Disney. They declared it a failure before it even got released. So it just shows, you know, what can happen when the studio changes behind you. Really tragic. Because I think I hadn't given my opinion. I thought it was better than the books. I like it a lot. I like all the stuff that they do with it that makes the bad guys more sophisticated. It's like they took all the bad guys from the first 2 or 3 books and kind of said, what if this was all one big conspiracy, and tied it all together? And, you know, Gods of Mars, or I guess John Carter 2, would have been great, because you've had more of dealing with those spooky god guys, you know, that teleport around. The Therns, yeah. Holy things.
And you know, if Disney really wanted to bring in a male audience, Deja Thoris, come on.
No kidding. Yeah, I mean, Lynn Collins in that movie was amazing in every sense of the word. I was very impressed.
Well, just you know, going back when I guess we were all young men reading, you know, these books, you know, we used our own imagination, and she had to be the most, well, luckily, this is my wife, by the way. So this was Deja Thoris to me. So everyone was able to stick their own ideas into that story and come up with what worked perfectly for them.
And sometimes even then, I was going to say, sometimes even then, it takes luck and fortuitous circumstances, because, you know, if you look at Star Wars, which is kind of space fantasy pulp, it's certainly not trying to be serious science fiction by any